Hi, it's the Stoic Pilgrim, and today's meditation I'm titling Ecco Dis. And just for disclosure to everyone in advance, to my non-Christian friends, to my friends who are either atheists or agnostics, even though there are religious themes in this, there's a greater story here, something in more detail than something of a broader scope than just some sort of Sunday morning sermon. So what I want to talk about today is Ecco Dis. Ecco Dis. If in Dante's Inferno, at the very end, Dante is led over a frozen lake, and he comes to a point, and I've always envisioned it as like a ledge. And his guide, Virgil, does this to him. He goes, this is how I visualize it. Virgil turns to Dante and he says, Ecco Dis, and he gestures towards Satan, who's frozen in the center of hell. You know, often we think of the fires of hell, but at the very center, according to Dante, is a frozen lake. And in the center of that frozen lake, which is the center of the earth, is Satan. And Satan is a horrendous creature with 3 heads throughout eternity, gnawing on the bodies of the 3 most heinous betrayers in history, Brutus, Cassius, and Judas. And Brutus and Cassius have their bodies outward. Their legs are sticking in the mouth and their heads are hanging out. Judas is just the opposite. His head is forward, and he's in the mouth of Satan, and he's being chewed with his legs sticking out. None of which are very enviable positions. However, the thing about it is that Satan is a horrendous, disgusting creature, and he is as horrendous and as ugly as he once was beautiful and magnificent. Don't forget that the story of Satan is one in which he was the most beautiful angel in heaven. He was called Morning Star, Lucifer, and he was gorgeous. He was beautiful. He was so great that he thought he could contend with God. In seeing God in his glory, Satan thought he could contend with him because he was so self-centered in his belief of himself and thinking of himself as so great. As a slight digression, there's always the question of why doesn't God just show himself? And one minister at one point said, well, God wouldn't do that, because if we saw God, he'd be so magnificent, so beautiful, that we would have to love God. We would have to turn towards God. We would lose our free will. But that whole argument is proven incorrect by Satan. But that's a digression. The idea, though, is that he is so horrendous and ugly that he's frightening. He's a horrific figure beyond description. And so when Virgil says to Dante, Ecco Dis, this is a name of Satan. It's not a New York way of saying this. It's Dis, a name of Satan. Also the name of the city in lower hell, which we'll get to in a second. But what turned him from something so beautiful to something so ugly? And that was sin. And I know we have a trouble sometimes with the word sin and talking about sin, but sin is evil. It's just simply evil. So if you have a problem with the word sin, really, I mean, let's use the word evil. So the evil turned Satan into this horrendous, ugly creature. And I was thinking of this the other day when I was in Bilbao. And in Bilbao, I was in the cathedral and I saw a picture of a crucifix. I saw a crucifix. And it reminded me of something when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I had an evangelical friend. He eventually converted me to evangelicalism away from Christianity. And he ranted. He used to rant about the Catholics have Jesus on the cross. And when you go into the Catholic Church, Jesus is still on that cross. And it's really, it's or the crucifix, on the cross. And really, the non-Catholics are really good people because they have taken Jesus off the cross. They've recognized Jesus' victory over death, and he didn't get it. See, there's a cross, and then there's a crucifix. A crucifix being where Jesus is still nailed to the cross. And you'll see these in Catholic churches. By the way, you'll also see these in Italian classrooms. At least last I heard, there was according to the Lateran Accords, a crucifix was put in the front of every classroom in Italy, and I'm not sure when it was. I think it was in the early 2000s or sometime in the 1990s. A woman had taken the Italian government to court saying that it was a form of proselytizing, which were against the European human rights, and the court found that no, it wasn't, because it was part of Italian culture. So even though it was something signed as part of the Lateran Accords and an agreement with the Catholic Church and Mussolini, this continued, but it's so ingrained, the Catholicism and the cross and the crucifix is so ingrained into Italian culture that the courts recognize it as a cultural symbol as well as a religious one. And I think that symbology of the crucifix is important, something my evangelical friend had missed. You see, when I look at the cross, or the crucifix, forgive me, when I look at the crucifix, what I'm seeing is sin, okay, evil. Let's replace the word evil, sin with the word evil. What I'm seeing is the result of evil. What I'm seeing is a man broken and beaten and bled, a man whose side has been speared, and who's been beaten and whipped and hung, nailed to a tree. A good man. I mean, if we accept the story of the Gospels, I have no reason not to accept that Jesus was a good man. A good man was treated like this. A good man was humiliated and executed simply for being good. And that's the thing about. Again, I'm looking at my notes. I'm sorry. I want to at least try to keep my thoughts somewhat coherent. So this is the whole idea, is that it's a symbol, not just a religious symbol, but a symbol of the result of evil, a symbol of the result of man's inhumanity to man. Ecco Dis. Echo Satan, echo the evil, the personification of evil when you look at the cross. Now, Christ is not that personification, but what was done to him was that personification of evil. So when you're a Catholic and you go to church on Sunday, what you are looking at is the suffering of a good man who went through this. And it's this visual representation. And the thing is, it's a lot of Christianity these days has a confused vision of what is evil and what are worse evils. And Dante, when he talks about hell, he has two layers. The first layer is incontinence. Now, I know there's a word. We use the word incontinence to mean someone who can't control their bodily functions, and that's kind of right. Incontinence is people who can't control themselves. And in the levels of hell, the upper levels of hell, the incontinence is, and mind you that the deeper you go in hell, the worse the sins are. So the topmost layer is limbo, where they are just pagans who did not have the knowledge of Christ. So they can't go to heaven, but they aren't punished as the others are in hell. In fact, it's kind of like a nice little garden that they hang out in, but they spend eternity in desire and not being able to unite with God. That's their punishment. And unbaptized babies, that's where they go, according to Dante. However, the next layer is lust, and it's funny, isn't it? I mean, the very next layer where people are actually getting punished is lust. When today it seems like so much of the message is lust and how bad the sexual sins are, but Dante, it's almost the least worse sin. Lust is people who can't control their bodies. Lust is people who so seek that physical gratification that they have no control over themselves. Well, they do. We know this from Stoicism, that we can control ourselves. They chose not to. That's why they're in hell. And the same thing with there's gluttony, people who can't control or who don't control. Don't is a better word. Their physical appetites. There's anger, people who don't control their temper. There's people who don't control their lust for money or their ability to properly spend money. Spendthrifts are in the same circle of hell as these others, the people who are greedy. But you know, when I've gone to churches and I've heard sermons, I hear a lot of sermons about those sorts of things, and that's interesting. Because according to Dante, they're the least damaging. And I agree with Dante, because in the lower layers of hell, in the city of Dis, the city of Satan, once you enter into that city, those are the lower circles, you start to get into people who actually set their mind to do evil. They're actually not people who can't control themselves as people with lust, but people who actually put their minds to doing a bad thing. And those are people like heretics, people who I've been told it's a uniquely Christian sin, but people who teach things that aren't correct. Those are people who do violence. Think about that. The warmongers, people who beat the drums for war. Those are in the lower layers. People who do harm to others or harm to themselves. Suicides, things like that. Then there's the eighth circle of hell, which is the bulges. They're kind of like, I think of them as grooves on a record, but within that eighth circle, there's 10 sins. And there's the flatterers, and then there's the seducers, there's the soothsayers. But the one that I really think belongs there are the simonists. Do you know what simony is? I bet you know what sodomy is, because that's preached about a lot. I bet you know about a lot of different words for a lot of different types of sins. But I bet you don't know what simony is. Maybe a lot of people don't. You know what simonists are? People who use the gospel, who use faith as a way of gain. And what they're doing, and Dante puts the popes in there, and they're put into these like holes, head first, and they're shoved down. And then the next one to come along is shoved on top of it, and they're constantly being shoved deeper and deeper and deeper into the ground, because they had their eyes so focused on earthly things as opposed to heavenly things. And these are did I just do that? That's like a preacher, didn't I? But these are the people who are so focused on earthly things that they miss the heavenly things. And they're so focused on gaining something from religion, gaining power, gaining money, gaining whatever they could. Those are simonists. Never heard that preached. Never heard that preached on Sunday morning. We're surrounded by Sunday morning guys who go around going, friends, you ever see this? Some of these guys, friends, this is my Bible. Friends, you got to send me. I heard one guy preaching once about how you had to send him money because God wanted him to have his own private jet. Imagine that. He had the nerve of saying that. And you see these guys. I mean, there's a mega church near where I live, And I went there one time. And I want to say it's the biggest mistake I ever made, but it gave me a good insight into what they were like. First, we happened to go there on like the 7th week after they had been preaching on giving money to the church, tithing. They've been preaching on giving money to the church for 7 weeks in a row. Imagine that for nearly 2 months. Every time you went to church on Sunday, you got to give, you got to give, you got to give. Think about that. And then when they got done with this big thing, and they added up what people all promised to give, and then what they did was they painted these like bricks of gold, and then they would stack them up while the pastor would sit on his knees going, oh, thank God, oh, God, oh. And he's on his knees and he's going, oh, Jesus, thank you, God, oh, it's so wonderful, oh. And the guy, I almost said something there. And the guy, that was bad enough. That was repulsive and repugnant. Are those two words synonyms? Those was disgusting enough. But they had more than one service. So did this clown do this multiple times in a week? See, because, okay, maybe once I could get, and maybe if he did it once, I just happened to be there, but it was still disgusting. But then, did he do it for every service? I don't know. I assume he did, because that's generally what churches do when they have multiple services, just repeat the same thing. So is this guy doing his little act of them piling up gold bars and him getting on his knees and, oh, thank you, Jesus, thank you, Jesus. Gosh darn it. And that's a Simonist. They build these great temples. Let me tell you something, folks. There's a guy in our neighborhood who's a pastor, and he's a pretty good guy. And you know what? His wife drives a car kind of like what my wife and I drive. In fact, I think they're a couple years older now that I think of it. And their house is pretty much like our house. He's a good guy. I've talked to him, and he really is a man of faith. But when you got these guys who want their private jets, when you have these guys who are driving fancy cars and, imports, and when they have their homes and their mansions and things like that, and they're asking you for money, that's not God. That's not the gospel. These guys are Simonists, and they disgust me. Same thing with the guys who get out there and they're preaching politics. And they say, oh, no, we're not preaching politics. We're just telling people the correct Christian way to vote. And we don't tell them who to vote for, but we tell them our opinions of the Christian version of politics. And they're Simonists as well, because they just want access to power. Jesus talked about how the Pharisees loved sitting in the high seats. These guys are not Christian. I'm no longer a Christian. I left the Christian church when the Christianity in the United States at least became a wholly owned subsidiary of the Republican Party. And they totally embraced the most vulgar and repulsive things I've ever seen. And all in the name of trying to pass legislation that reflects the gospel as they may see it. And it's disgusting and it's simony. And that may be harsh, but it's correct. So, and I'm not here to argue against Christianity. That's the last thing I want to do. But there's, like I said, this pastor down the street, good man of God, man of faith. And, you have a choice. You have a choice when it comes to churches. But you see, they get their sins backwards. They don't have a problem with simony. They don't have a problem with flatterers. They don't have a problem with flattering. They don't have a problem with bad counsel and providing bad counsel, because they're providing things that are a way of gaining power. See, those are the lower layers of hell. Those are the really serious sins. Never heard a lot of preaching on that sort of thing. Heard a lot of preaching on things like, lust and, how the homosexual agenda and the transgender agenda and all these other things, but I haven't heard a lot of preaching on simony. And I'm trying not, I don't want to be talking about politics here, but the point is that they use the gospel for hate, and they forget what the gospel is about. And I really didn't mean for this conversation to go in this direction, but it is, because that's the point. Is it's the lower layers of hell are people who seek to do evil, and it leads to hate, and hate leads to the cross. Not the cross in the sense of it leads to the cross for us to receive forgiveness. When you hate, it leads to things like the cross, like the crucifixion. So when you look on the cross, Ecco Dis, echo Satan, echo sin, look on sin. Here is sin, here is Satan. Guernica, Ecco Dis, here is sin, here is Satan. The Armenian genocide, Ecco Dis, here is sin, here is Satan. The Holocaust, Ecco Dis, here is sin, here is Satan. That's what these things are. And the evil that men try to create, men and women, the evil that people in power try to create to turn you against your neighbor, to turn you against others, to foment hate, Ecco Dis, echo sin, echo Satan. Here is sin, here is Satan. That's what these things are. So we need to turn our back on these types of people. When people tell you to hate others, we need to turn our back. When people tell you that because you're superior, your faith is superior, maybe your race is superior, maybe your country is superior, maybe your political party is superior, maybe whatever group you happen to belong to is superior, therefore those others are less. You are on the path to Calvary. Again, not as the one crucified, but as the one to do the crucifixion. Ecco Dis. Here is sin. Here is Satan. So, what do? As I said, you turn your back on these people. You remember that we are all part of the human family. We are all connected. We are all one. We remember that we must employ our critical thinking. Does this really make sense, what they're saying? Does it really hold water? And challenge those things that you hold most dear. My son told me that once. You need to challenge those things you most hold dear. And the more dear you hold them, the greater must be the challenge. That's what you need to do. And when you do that, when you really do that, when you really challenge and use your critical thinking skills, and when you don't fear the future, but you use your reason to look at what you believe or what you think, then you won't fall prey to these people who want to foment hate. I guess it's been a bit of a theme in a couple of these meditations. But remember that. Remember, we're all one. I mean, if you're watching the other videos of the non-meditation videos of my Camino, it's great. I mean, I'm talking to people from all over the world, and no one says, "Oh, you're an American, so therefore," or "Oh, you're a German, you're therefore," "Oh, you're not a Christian, therefore." There are non-Christians on the Camino. You're not of this, or you're not of that, therefore, or you are of this, or you are of that, therefore. None of that's on the Camino. We're having a great time. People from all over the world. Some people you can't even communicate with, because that's what the Camino is about. And like I said, the Camino is life in microcosm, and that's what life's about. We're all one big family. We're all people, and with our own hurts and our own pains, and we're all here. We should all be here for one another as we go through those hurts and pains. Now, forgive me if I rambled on. I see this has been a long time, and if you're still with me, thank you. But I try to present these things in a coherent fashion, but it is stuff that I don't have a script for. I'm just kind of like talking off my head and from my notes. And I'm not a preacher, and I'm not trying to preach or convince you or convert you or anything like that. I'm just telling you some of the thoughts I've had as I walk the Camino. And some of the thoughts are these thoughts, because I see people hurting, and I see some of the cruelty that's occurred in this world. And this is just what I've been thinking about. I don't know. Think about it. See if it makes sense. If it does, great. If it doesn't, hope it didn't waste too much of your time. Anyways, buen camino. And remember, cast away everything until all you have left is love.